The crossing lay where it always had. A wide river narrowed slightly between low banks, its current slowed by a bend upstream and shallow shelves beneath the surface. For generations, caribou had crossed here in late winter, when cold locked water into a reliable surface and the land aligned briefly with movement. This year, it did not. The caribou reached the bank at first light, breath rising in slow clouds that drifted sideways in weak wind. His coat was thick, pale with darker guard hairs along the neck and shoulders, shedding frost with each step. Antlers, still heavy from the season, framed his head like tools he no longer needed but could not yet lose. He stopped at the edge. The river did not look frozen. It looked paused. Ice stretched across most of its width, but unevenly, dull grey in places, glassy and dark in others. Snow lay thin and patchy, refusing to hide what lay beneath. Where the current pressed hardest, water showed through as long black seams. The caribou lowered his head and listened. Ice spoke, not loudly, not with the sharp cracks of deep winter, but with soft, hollow sounds that travelled along the surface rather than through it. The sound changed with each shift of temperature, each movement of water below. This ice was young, or tired, possibly both. Behind him, others gathered. Not a tight herd, a loose line of bodies arriving in stages, their movements slowing as they reached the same point of hesitation. Hooves pressed into snow-darkened ground, packing it into a narrow apron at the river's edge. No one stepped forward yet. Crossings were not led by strength alone, they were tested. The first step mattered more than the 100th. The caribou extended one foreleg and touched the ice lightly. It held. The surface resisted his weight, but without confidence. A faint vibration travelled back up his leg, subtle but unmistakable. The ice flexed, not enough to break, but enough to answer. He withdrew the hoof and shifted sideways, testing another spot closer to the bank where snow had accumulated slightly thicker. Snow insulated ice. Sometimes that helped. The sound changed again. A deeper note now, a sharp, more spread. Water moved close beneath this section, stealing cold faster than air could replace it. The caribou lifted his head. The opposite bank lay not far away, a strip of darker land rising gently into scrub and sparse trees. Beyond it stretched ground that still held forage beneath snow, ground the herd needed to reach before reserves thinned too far. Waiting cost energy, crossing cost risk. The season had shifted faster than memory allowed. The ice had not finished becoming what it used to be. One of the caribou behind him stepped forward, then stopped, sensing hesitation ripple through the group. Another shifted position, hooves scraping softly against frozen mud. The river made no promise. It did not rush. It did not still. It moved quietly beneath a surface that pretended to be solid long enough to invite commitment. The caribou placed his hoof on the ice again. This time he pressed slightly harder. A fine crack traced outward, not breaking through, but writing itself briefly across the surface before fading as pressure released. The sound was dull, absorbed quickly by cold air. Thin, already thin. He stood still, weight balanced carefully over all four legs, feeling the river work beneath him even before he stepped onto it fully. The crossing had arrived on schedule. The ice had not. And the caribou, standing at the edge of a route that no longer waited for readiness, understood that this season would not allow the comfort of certainty, only the choice between moving early onto weakening ground or remaining until waiting itself became a different kind of danger. The first step onto the ice was not forward, it was downward. The caribou lowered his body slightly, bending his forelegs just enough to shift weight gradually rather than commit it all at once. His hoof pressed into the surface with controlled pressure, testing resistance the way one tested soil before crossing bog or drift. The ice responded immediately. A low sound travelled outward beneath the surface. Not a crack, not yet, but a spreading murmur that moved faster than the eye could follow. It was the sound of layers adjusting, of water redistributing pressure beneath something not meant to carry it for long. The caribou froze. Every muscle held steady, balance tightened. His breath slowed, nostrils flaring just once as he tasted cold air and metal-scented water rising faintly through the ice. Nothing broke. The surface flexed, then steadied, settling into a temporary agreement with the weight placed upon it. He brought the second foreleg forward. This step mattered more. With both forelegs on the ice, his centre of mass shifted outward from the bank. Retreat would now require reversal under load, possible but costly. The sound beneath him deepened slightly, stretching rather than snapping. Behind him, the herd remained still. No one crowded forward. No one rushed to follow. Each animal waited for information carried not by sight, but by vibration through frozen ground and water. The caribou paused again. Wind moved lightly across the river, skimming the surface and stealing sound before it could echo. Snow grains slid across the ice, tracing shallow lines that showed the current's direction beneath. He advanced one careful half-step. Now all four hooves stood on the ice. The river answered. A fine network of cracks bloomed briefly around his feet, thin and pale, spreading outward like veins before halting. They did not open, they did not widen. They appeared, then stopped, a warning written in fragile lines. The sound that followed was softer than expected. Not the sharp report of failure, but a dampened groan, as if the ice were bending rather than breaking. Water pressed upward against the underside, lifting slightly, then settling again as the current shifted. The caribou held position. Panic would transfer weight unevenly. Speed would multiply force. Survival here depended on stillness applied at the right moments. Another caribou stepped onto the ice behind him, then another. They did not bunch. Spacing mattered. Each animal placed hooves where cracks had already formed, not because those places were weaker, but because the ice there had already answered once. Fresh pressure was easier to read than unknown surface. The river carried their combined weight reluctantly. Cracks lengthened, some connected, others faded. The ice spoke constantly now, not loudly, but persistently, a chorus of small adjustments travelling beneath the herd. The sound never settled into silence long enough to reassure. Halfway to the centre, the texture changed. Snow vanished almost completely here, swept away by wind and thin warmth. The ice darkened, turning translucent, revealing slow movement beneath. Shadows slid past, distorted by depth and current. The caribou slowed further. He lowered his head, antlers angled back to reduce drag if he needed to turn suddenly. His hooves spread slightly on contact, increasing surface area, distributing load as best his anatomy allowed. A sharp sound rang out. One crack opened farther than the others, splitting audibly a short distance ahead before stopping just as abruptly. Water seeped upward along the line, wetting the surface and darkening it instantly. The herd halted as one, not from command, from shared understanding. They stood on ice that had begun to admit what lay beneath it. The opposite bank looked closer now, but distance here was deceptive. The most dangerous section of any crossing was rarely the middle. It was the moment when confidence began to replace caution. The caribou did not move. He waited for the ice to finish adjusting, for the water beneath to redistribute pressure, and choose whether it would continue to hold. Cold tightened again as a cloud passed over the sun. The ice stiffened slightly, just enough to slow seepage along the crack. The sound softened. Not reassurance. Opportunity. The caribou took another step forward. Slowly. Carefully. Knowing that from this point on, each movement would cost more than the last, and that the river would not announce its final decision until after it had been made. The herd did not surge. It began to move the way pressure moves through ice, gradually, unevenly, without a single point of origin. One caribou advanced, then paused. Another followed, adjusting distance instinctively. Spacing widened and narrowed as animals read not each other, but the surface beneath them. The river accepted this cautiously. Cracks multiplied. They did not race outward, but crept, lengthening a few centimeters at a time, linking briefly before stopping. Each new line altered the soundscape, higher tones where ice thinned, lower where water pressed closer to the surface. The caribou at the front slowed again. He felt the change through his forelegs first. The ice no longer returned pressure evenly. One hoof rested on firmer resistance, the other on something that flexed more deeply before responding. He shifted his weight back slightly. Not retreat, correction. Behind him, the herd mirrored the adjustment without seeing it. Bodies slowed, heads lowered, antlers angled back. No one pushed forward. No one attempted to pass. This was how crossings failed less often, not through strength, but through restraint shared across many animals without signal or sound. Water seeped through several cracks now, thin sheets spread across the surface, freezing almost immediately at the edges while remaining slick at the center. Hooves slid slightly with each step, forcing muscles to engage constantly to prevent loss of balance. A young caribou near the rear stepped too close to another. The ice answered sharply. A loud crack snapped outward beneath them, travelling fast and clean for several meters before halting. The sound cut through the herd like a command. Everything stopped. Not a single hoof moved. The crack did not open. It widened briefly, then stabilized, edges dark with water that rose and then retreated as pressure redistributed again. The young caribou trembled, not visibly, but through the ice. The vibration carried forward, felt by the led animal almost immediately. He paused longer this time, allowing the river to finish its adjustment. Cold tightened again. Wind slid across the surface, stealing heat from exposed ice and stiffening it just enough to slow flex. The sound beneath softened, not disappearing, but dulling. The moment passed. Movement resumed. Slowly. Deliberately. The herd advanced in staggered lines now, no longer a single arc, but a loose formation designed to prevent synchronized pressure. Each animal chose slightly different footing, avoiding fresh ice whenever possible. The opposite bank grew closer. Details sharpened. Patches of darker soil, frozen sedge, a shallow ramp where water met land at a gentler angle. That final section mattered. Ice often failed nearest shore, undermined by moving water and trapped heat. The caribou angled his path slightly upstream. Crossing diagonally reduced pressure on any one point. It lengthened the route but improved odds. Another crack opened ahead. This one did not stop immediately. It ran forward several body lengths, splitting the surface audibly before halting at a darker seam. Water surged briefly, then settled. No one ran. Running would finish what sound had begun. The herd paused again, breath steaming in uneven clouds that drifted sideways and vanished. Muscles burned from constant correction. Fat reserves thinned with each minute spent holding weight in readiness rather than movement. The ice held, barely. The caribou took another step, then another. The lead animals reached the final stretch, ice that had thinned not from age, but from movement beneath. Here, sound changed completely. The ice no longer groaned, it whispered. A thin, continuous sound, like fabric stretched too far, never snapping, but never resting. This was the point of no return. Stopping here invited collapse from standing still. Retreat would concentrate weight where cracks had already weakened the surface. The herd advanced together now, not faster, but without further pauses. The river did not resist loudly. It flexed, bent, and complained in soft, constant ways, but did not break. Water welled up around hooves, freezing and melting in cycles too fast to resolve. Then the first caribou stepped onto land. Frozen mud yielded underhoof with a sound that was solid, unquestionable. Weight transferred fully. The river released its hold on him at once. Others followed, not all at once, one by one. As each animal left the ice, pressure reduced slightly, easing the strain for those still crossing. The sound softened further. Cracks stopped spreading. The caribou reached the far bank and turned his head once. Several still stood on the ice behind him. The The crossing was not finished yet, but it was no longer uncertain. The ice had already decided how much it would give, and the herd, by refusing panic and speed, had taken exactly that, no more, no less, knowing that survival here was not about outrunning collapse, but about moving carefully enough that collapse never needed to complete itself. The crossing ended without celebration. The last caribou stepped onto the far bank as carefully as the first had stepped onto the ice. No one accelerated. No one lingered. Each animal moved far enough inland to free space for the next, spreading weight across ground that could finally absorb it. The river quieted, not immediately, but steadily. As pressure lifted, cracks stopped lengthening. Water retreated beneath the surface, pulling cold back with it. Thin films froze into dull skins that erased the most obvious signs of stress. The ice did not break. It simply stopped being tested. A few caribou remained behind on the near bank. They had turned away earlier, sensing something others did not. A difference in timing, a tolerance for waiting that outweighed the cost of crossing. They stood still now, watching the far side without sound or signal. They would cross later, or somewhere else, or not at all. The herd that had crossed did not wait. They moved upslope in loose formation, spreading into ground that smelled different. Older snow, buried plants, soil that held moisture longer. Grazing would not be easy, but it would be possible. That was enough. The lead caribou slowed once, lifting his head and breathing deeply. Behind him, the river lay unchanged in appearance. From a distance, the ice looked intact, smooth, almost trustworthy again. No sign marked how close it had come to refusal, how narrow the margin had been between holding and failure. That was how crossings always ended, not with evidence, with absence. The caribou continued on. Their tracks led away from the river and into terrain that would soon erase them with wind and drifting snow. What mattered now was not the crossing itself, but what followed: feeding, recovery, rebuilding strength spent on caution rather than motion. Behind them, the ice continued to thin. Not from weight, from time. By afternoon, the sun would soften its surface again. By evening, seams would widen. By morning, this route would no longer be an option at all. Those who had crossed early enough had done so at the edge of possibility. Those who waited would face a different decision later, shaped by different costs. The river did not remember either choice. It would carry on, breaking and reforming according to forces that did not pause for migration or need. The caribou moved forward into land that could still receive them, carrying no memory of the sounds beneath their hooves, only the quiet certainty that the ice had been thin already, and that waiting for it to become what it used to be would have been the greater risk. The crossing was over. The season moved on. And the river, having held just long enough, returned to doing what it always did best, changing without asking who was ready.